between the government and the grassroots or the general citizens, the existence of weak institutions, that we have not been able to build strong institutions that can stand any West leadership or dictatorship in the world. And state-party conflation, looking at how the government departments have been conflated with state institutions. For example, the issues like the militarization of the judiciary, the capture of the police force, and also political corruption. And in terms of the processes, they have to follow the key principles that we have mentioned, that the processes have to be national, they have to be inclusive, they have to be non-partisan, and they have to be knowledge-based professionalism. Thank you.
Right, thank you. Are there any reactions from the floor? Going once, going twice.
Yes, the comment on the militarization of what? You said of the judiciary. Could it be true? If there is only one person there, would you say it is militarized? I won't mention names, but if there is one individual, could you say it is militarized? Thank you.
Okay, I think it's a point to note. There was a hand next there.
I think I heard political corruption, and I wanted to just confirm if we are just looking at political corruption or corruption in general, because corruption in general takes away the people's power to hold politicians to account.
Okay.
So,
thanks. I think take note for that for the purposes of drafting and refining the content. Those two comments. I saw, were there other hands here? None. Okay. If we may have the survivor support group, which had Vamchaliama and Fundo.
Thank you, and I'll present on behalf of the Victims or Survivors Support Group. I'll just briefly highlight the main points because we had about 5 pages of rich contributions. In terms of issues, the main issues that need to be looked into include victim protection, to include the actual physical protection or psychological protection of the victims to avoid re-traumatization. There's also psychosocial support. It's an issue that needs to be considered. Victims need to be consulted in the process to consider what the victims want or define as support. Also, the identification of victims should be done. A thorough process to say who's a victim and who's not a victim. Also, there should be elements of reconciliation as violations happen within communities and we have people who are still living with the perpetrators of the violations that happen to them. We also need to look at the peculiar factor where we have perpetrators also having the dual role as victims. How do we deal with situations such as those? We also need to look into documentation, particularly with the issues that were being raised throughout these 3 days. People without identifications, how this can be done and how this can be rectified. I'll quickly move to processes. The processes that will look into victims or survivors support should make reference to the regional mechanisms that we have, or at least policies that have been set at regional level. This includes the TJ policy at the African Commission, together with the General Comment 4. The processes should also consider language barriers and cultural considerations. Also, guarantees of non-repetition of people within the communities. Again, on processes, there should be a proper feasibility study such that we need to start small before going full scale to see if the processes are actually beneficial and actually what we need. There should be speedy actions, or at least there should be proper timeframes to cater for victims who may be elderly and we have evidence that may wear away due to weather and time. There should be mechanisms also to ensure that victims are safe through particularly assurance and trust building. This was the biggest point, because we noticed that if there's no trust within the processes, really we're not doing anything. This also links to independence of whatever the independence of the actors within the processes. This should include the actual independence and what we perceive as independence. If we don't deal with those issues, then the processes won't really go far. And then, in terms of roles and responsibilities, we listed out quite a number of stakeholders. We've got alleged perpetrators, we've got victims, we've got community leaders, the NPRC, CSOs and CBOs. We talked about some of the responsibilities. I'll just briefly highlight, such as the Ministry of Education, because there needs to be a particular transformation agenda to look into the broader issues, such as language barriers and whatever history narrative we're giving to the school children. We need to look into having the Ministry of Social Welfare, the Ministry of Health, to coordinate healthcare and social welfare provision. There was also a large stakeholder being the Ministry of Home Affairs, but largely categorized as the security sector, who are the ones who need to be capacitated in dealing with, particularly investigating TJ-related cases. They also need to look into the registration, particularly the Ministry of Home Affairs, to look into the registration of births, the registration of deaths. There also needs to be reformation of the police from top up, because there's, as we all know, the attitude with citizens and the police in the past, a relationship needed to be built. We also have the Ministry of Information as the key stakeholder, because if public discourse is to include everyone's narrative, they should be the key driver of that process. There's also spiritual leaders together with the Ministry of Justice. I think the last point there should be the process, the roles and responsibilities should include a multi-stakeholder approach, such that we all know that every player has something to bring to the table within all the processes. I think I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any additions from the floor, points of clarification? None. All right. Let's move on to the next group. Truth Committee. I think it was Father Jerome was in that.
Afternoon, everyone. I'll present on the Truth Committee. Firstly, we looked at the content. Number one, defining a Truth Committee. How do we get the truth? What truth? Whose truth? Where is the truth being told? The types or forms of truth. Conducive conditions for telling truth. Who has the right to hear the truth? Freedom before, during, and after the truth. Platforms for telling the truth. Forms of telling the truth. For example, factual, forensic, public, private, women only, curriculum. And then sources of the truth, sensitivity to culture, sensitivity to gender, victim or offender oriented, truth which is in the government's held records, protecting the truth from deliberate untruth, and equal opportunity to express the truth. And then the second section was to outline, number one, minimum basics for truth seeking, prioritize truth telling, early warning systems, determination of starting point, period, geographical, consultations with communities, classification of conflicts, beyond the commission, what is to be done, and then implementation mechanisms. We go on to the roles and responsibilities. What is the role of the NPRC? Collaboration with other stakeholders. Zeroing it down to work with other commissions, work with CSOs, work with traditional leaders, churches, businesses, and locals. And then priority setting, transparency within the NPRC, the role of the media, statement recording, for example, with children, and then ownership of the process. Which then leads to a discussion for the arguments for and against the time-bound methods of the NPRC. Thank you.
Are there any additions to that, or comments or questions? I think there's more fatigue than of questions. Thank you. Thank you. Let's have the archival reference group.
Yeah.
I think it was Elizabeth.
Yes, we are here. Thank you.
Okay.
All right, so we discussed processes, roles, and responsibilities. One of the things that emerged in our group was that information needs to be verifiable, the importance of content, context, and also the need for appropriate training. We looked at issues around intellectual property, the openness and willingness to also share information, how to keep the data in our database, the understanding of data collection and archiving, as well as data sharing and agreements. In terms of specific action points, we developed a sort of skeleton framework with action points. We said that the TJ working group has shown will to archive, which is great. It has sent out information around processes, what processes have been done in the past, but it also needs to be resent again to include new organizations, changes internally within organizations, and also to flag the issue around marginalized groups. And also the importance of what criteria goes into the filing and archiving. Another action point was around the fact that organizations must commit to acquisition guidelines so that we have minimum standards, verifiable data on the combined database. Of course, then we need to introduce sort of rigorous processes and standards around that. We decided that appropriate budgeting ought to be in place as a key element for our work. That also includes human resources, technology, as well as training. Needs assessment for members of organizations, but also from the outside to assess training needs, as well as to get training for the specific gaps. And here as well we included language accommodation and appropriate